Happy Mother's Day to each one of you, or to each one of you women. Not Happy Mother's Day to the men, I guess. It's good to have you here. It's good to have some visitors here. You're always welcome to worship with us. We trust it'll be a good time, of encouraging time together. This morning we're going to be looking at the story of a mother from the Bible, a story that is so encouraging to me. I believe that this woman in the Bible, Hannah, is such a great example of what her name actually means. Her name means a woman of grace. It means grace. And so we're going to be looking at that story here this morning. We're taking a little break from Ephesians to honor the women here on Mother's Day. Now, if you remember in our study of Ephesians, we came across the word grace, and we realized that we kind of came across a little bit of a different meaning of grace than sometimes we look at it, and that is the resulting activity or the outworking, if you will, that is a necessary consequence of God's will, God's goodwill in your life. So, to put it in a little different words, so God has goodwill in your life, and now there is a necessary consequence or outworking of that, and that's what grace is. That is grace in our lives. What happens as a result of God's goodwill in our life? And Hannah shows this in her life, in the different stages of her life. Now, the setting of this story is interesting to me. As I was looking at when this may have taken place in the Bible, it struck me that, we studied Ruth just a couple months ago, and if you think about it, Samuel anointed David as king when he was probably a teenager, I guess. And so Samuel may have been about the age of David's grandfather when he did that. So David's grandfather was Ruth's son Obed. So this story probably is taking place about the same time as the end of the book of Ruth. If you look at how that, it could have been 20 or 30 years either way, but that's about the time where this setting is taking place. Now, it's a dark time in Israel's history right now. So it's the time of the judges. Joshua has died, and if you remember, Judges begins by saying that the new generation came up who knew not the Lord. A dark time in their history. They would go from being overtaken by their enemy nations, and then they would turn to God, and God would rise up a judge, and he would bring them back to God, and then they would experience blessings, and then they would fall away. And it was just this roller coaster time for Israel. And there's a lot of parallels we can see between Hannah's life and the life of Israel, the nation in this story. Now, as we look at the events in this story, one thing that I want us to notice throughout this portion of the story is how that Hannah always trusts God, it seems like. She trusts God with the journey that she's on. And with this, whatever stage of the journey that she's in, she trusts God with that journey. And so the question for us is, are you willing to trust God with your current reality? What is your current reality? What are you living right now? And are you willing to trust God with that? This is not easy. This is not an easy question. And the other part of that is, does the outworking of God's goodwill in your life look like grace in the reality that you find yourself in right now? Does it look like grace with that outworking or that consequence of God's goodwill in your life? So in this story, we find 4 stages of Hannah's journey. It's chapter 1. We're looking at 1 Samuel chapter 1, the entire chapter. And there's 4 basic stages that we're going to walk through in this journey. It's Hannah's sorrow, which is her reality. It's what she's experiencing at the beginning. And then her response to that reality is Hannah's supplication. Then God's response to Hannah's response is Hannah's son. And then she responds again to that new reality, that awesome reality of the son, with sacrifice. So we see Hannah's sorrow, Hannah's supplication, Hannah's son, and Hannah's sacrifice. Those are the 4 steps we're going to be looking at here. And so let's begin in verse 1. There was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. He had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now this man used to go up year by year from his city to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. And her rival used to provoke her grievously, to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. So it went on, year by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. And Elkanah her husband said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? All right, so that first section there gives us a picture of this first reality that we see in Hannah's life here in the story, and that is her sorrow. Hannah's sorrow. Now, she has 3 sources of sorrow that I noticed in these first 8 verses. And the first source of her sorrow is that she is barren. She's empty. Her life feels meaningless. She's all alone. How many of us also experience that on some level, in some way? We experience that emptiness in life so many times, and we're not sure if our life even has any purpose. And this was a real problem for Hannah. This was her reality. It's what she felt deep in her heart. And what is the purpose behind that? Why does a loving God allow this in her life? And I thought about Paul and some of his instructions about this. He experienced this as well on some level. And in 1 Corinthians 12, he talks some about the trial that he was going through. And he was questioning God as to why does this have to be? And how could you change this for me, possibly? And I want to just quickly read a couple of these verses in 2 Corinthians 12. Verses 9 and 10 are what I want to really focus on, but I'm going to read 7 through 10 to give us a bit of the background there. So Paul's saying here, so to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said, now here's God's response to Paul when he's asking about why this distress, why this trouble. Jesus says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So that was Paul's response to a tough situation. He says, when I am weak of myself, then Christ can shine through and make us strong and be strong. And Christ can be revealed even more. And he says, my grace is sufficient. And that is a promise that we can take to heart when we are feeling that emptiness or that barrenness or unfruitful, whatever it might be in your life that you may be feeling. My grace is sufficient, God says. Whatever the reality is in your life. Now, the second source of sorrow that Hannah was sensing here was she had an antagonist. She had somebody that just grated at her. How many of us have one of those in our lives too, right? No, don't point to them and don't elbow them if they're sitting next to you. But we all have those people in our lives, right? Those people that just, they just grind us. We don't know what to do with them. They know how to push our buttons, right? And she had one of these in her life. But how do we respond to that person is the real question. How do we respond when there's a person in our life that is just kind of antagonistic and pushes our buttons? Does it look like grace? Does it involve dignity and honor? Is that how we respond? We don't know exactly how Hannah responded to this antagonist, but we do not see her lashing out in this story. It seems like she just took it, wept, and was sorrowful, but she did not really lash out. It does not appear anyway. So that was the second source of her sorrow here. She had sorrow because she was empty and barren. She had sorrow because she had an antagonist. And she also, this is something none of you women here can relate to, I'm sure, but she had a husband who didn't seem to get it. I mean, how arrogant of him. He says, am I not worth more than 10 sons to you? Of course not. Like, this guy didn't really get it. He didn't understand what this woman really needed. And so that was another source of sorrow in Hannah's life. She has 3 sources of sorrow that they list here, but how does she respond to it? Does she respond by as a reflection of her name, what her name means? What is the response of Hannah here? Well, we see that in verses 9 through 18. So let's see what her response is to the sorrow. After they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose. Now, they were at the temple now. They had went up to Shiloh to sacrifice. Now, Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart, only her lips moved, and her voice was not heard. Therefore, Eli took her to be a drunken woman. And Eli said to her, How long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you. But Hannah answered, No, my Lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. Then Eli answered, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him. And she said, Let your servant find favor in your eyes. Then the woman went to her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. So here we see her response to the sorrow that we saw in the first part of this story. The reality that she was living was sorrow. Her response to that is supplication. Now, supplication, by definition, is the action of asking or begging for something earnestly or humbly. Okay, so asking or begging for something earnestly or humbly. So what does Hannah's supplication look like? Well, number one, she cries out to God. It tells us that very clearly. She cries out to God in her distress, in her sorrow. She cries out to God. Now, a note that I would like to add here is that the man that Hannah's son would one day anoint as king of Israel got this. He understood this really well. And we read about his supplications in Psalm. We see a lot of that. He was a man after God's own heart, and he shows us what it looks like to lament, to really cry out to God and say, Oh God, I feel like I'm sinking into this pit, or my enemies are triumphing over me, and I don't know which way to turn, and my life is a mess. And David does that well. He laments. He cries out to God when he's feeling sad and he's feeling empty and barren. He goes to God. He cries out to God. And Hannah does this here in this story here. And she gets specific about her request as well, and that's okay. God just wants us to lean into him. He wants us to come to him with our sorrow. That may even be the purpose that he allows emptiness and sorrow in our lives, because he wants us to draw closer to him, to lean in, and to look to him for strength. And that's what Hannah does here. She makes some specific requests. She cries out to God. She asks for a son. She says exactly what she wants. She doesn't want a dog or a daughter. She wants a son, and she's willing to tell God that. Go to God with your emptiness or your sorrow, whatever it is that you may be experiencing as a reality in your life. Take it to God. Cry out to God. The next thing that I see that she's willing to do as a supplication is she allows a godly person to speak into her life. She's at the temple, and Eli is engaging with her in her sorrow, and she accepts his words of instruction or advice or truth that he wants to speak into her life. Who is that person in your life? Who's the godly person that you're allowing to speak into your sorrow? Into that private grief that you may be feeling, into your distress. I'm not saying go out on the street and just air all of it to the stranger walking down the street, but find that person that you trust, somebody that you know is going to have your back and that cares deeply about you, and allow them into your pain, into your sorrow. Speak to them about it. Don't carry it alone. Do not go it alone. That is not how God intended for us to do life. So in her supplication, she cries out to God. She allows a godly person to speak into her sorrow. And then she releases her sorrow into God's care. Now that's where trust comes in. That really, really requires a lot of trust in order to really release that then. When we're feeling a sorrow in our life, to say, God, okay, I came to you, I cried out to you, I shared it with a friend, now I'm releasing that into your hands. And it says that her face was no longer sad. She rose up, her face was not sad. She says, all right, this is God's now, and I'm releasing it. And I'm not here to tell you that it's easy, or I'm not trying to tell you that just do it, just forget about your sorrow. No, it is not easy. I'm sure it's very difficult. But if we're able to really, really trust that God does care about your sorrow and then release it, there is a freedom that comes with that. And Hannah experiences that in this story. So Hannah had sorrow, and her response was supplication. Now, what is God's response? A loving God's response when his child comes to him in supplication. We find that in verses 19 through 24, I believe. Verse 19, they rose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord. Then they went back to their house in Ramah, and Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. And in due time Hannah conceived and bore a son. And she called his name Samuel, for she said, I have asked for him from the Lord. The man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and to pay his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, as soon as the child is weaned, I will bring him, so that he may appear in the presence of the Lord and dwell there forever. Elkanah, her husband, said to her, do what seems best to you. Wait until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord establish his word. So the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him. The story is turning into a very beautiful story, isn't it? I just love the way this is the turn of events here. Now she has a son. God has blessed her with a son. He's responded to her supplication with a son. And she calls his name Samuel. That means heard from God. She has heard from God. She recognizes that. She sees her son as a gift from God. When God responds to our supplication, we need to recognize that this is not just coincidence. This is not just me working hard and making my way, but it is God answering our cry. It is God's gift to his child. She sees that he is an answer to her prayer. And I see this as such a beautiful picture of the gospel message. You know, God's people, the church, go from sorrow We're so sad. We're emptiness. We have nothing on our own. Sin is holding us in bondage. That is our sorrow. And then we go to Jesus, we go to God, and we cry out in supplication. We say we need an answer. We need to be saved from this bondage. We need the Messiah. Will you please send us a Messiah, God's people? We're crying out to him for that. And then God responded to his people by sending his Son. He sent his Son to his people as the answer to their supplication. Isn't that a beautiful picture of the gospel message? This little story of Hannah has the message of the Messiah kind of buried in it. And it's also Samuel is a forerunner of, he's a type of Christ as well. He brings joy and peace. Jesus brings joy and peace to God's people. And Samuel brought much joy and peace to Hannah as well. She sees that her son is a gift from God. And then this husband that didn't seem to be very understanding, well, she allows him to speak into that. She doesn't shut him out of her blessing. When God responds to her with blessings, she allows him to speak into this. And he gives some counsel to her, and they have some interactions about how this will look. And then she cares for her son and prepares him for service. Now there's probably a lot here that's going on that isn't written in this story, but I'm just picturing it. I think it's okay for us to imagine just a little bit. She was probably the most doting mother in town. Like, can you just imagine her, just this, God has finally blessed her with this son, and Peninnah can have her 10 kids over here, but she has Samuel, and she just cares for everything is about this little boy, and she feeds him organic foods only, and she's got him, reading at 2 already, probably. But there's probably a piece of her wanting to wait to potty train him as long as possible, because once he's weaned, she's going to be taking him back to the temple. And she loves this child so, so dearly. But she's caring for him because she is about to bring him back to give him to God. To bring him back to God. She's about to give this cherished possession back to God. And that is her response to this amazing new reality that she has. She had sorrow. Her response to that was supplication. God responded with the son. And now how will Hannah respond to this son that God has blessed her with? We see that in verse 24 through 28. And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine. And she brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh, and the child was young. Then they slaughtered the bull, and they brought the child to Eli. And she said, "O my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who was standing here in your presence, praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord." And he worshiped the Lord there. Notice how she's willing to speak out to people about God's blessings in her life. She's willing to share that with anybody that's willing to listen, really. But this brings us to the fourth and last stage of Hannah's journey in this passage here, and that is her sacrifice. She is willing to trust God with her most cherished possession. I'm sure Samuel was the center of her life, and she was willing to trust this into the hands of God. Are you willing to trust God? Can we trust God with our most cherished and prized possessions? Whatever it is in our life that we cherish the most, are we willing to trust it into God's hands? That is a real question that I've been asking myself as I've been studying this story. This is a true picture of sacrifice, when we're willing to give our best back to God, what we so desperately wanted. But there's another type of sacrifice that I see her offering as well, and that is the sacrifice of praise to God. Hannah brings a sacrifice of praise to God. And we find that actually in the very next chapter, and I'm going to read that to you. I think we have a few minutes yet here where we can take a few minutes to do this. I'm going to read the first 11 verses of chapter 2, and it's really her her sacrifice to God as a response to the blessing that God gave her. And Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exalts in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies, because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness. For not by might shall a man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. Then Elkanah went home to Ramah, and the boy was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli the priest. That is her response to her God, who had blessed her with a son. So, the question we come back to is, are we willing to trust God with our current reality? Where we find ourselves today, are we willing to trust him with that reality? What is your current reality? Probably only you really know what that might be. Hannah's was deep sorrow. She was experiencing sorrow in her life, and she trusted God with that sorrow, with that barrenness, that emptiness that she was experiencing. She went to God in supplication. She cried out to him. She lamented. She leaned in. Don't shut God out of your journey, however difficult it may be. Do not shut God out of the journey that you're on. He can be trusted. I promise you, God can be trusted with your reality, whatever it may be. But when he answers, when he brings you that blessing, when he brings you the son, when he brings you that most cherished possession, are you still willing to trust God with your reality? Are you willing to give it back to God, to hold it out to him with an open hand? Folks, this is the safest place you can possibly place your cherished possession, is back in the hands of God. And then can we bring a sacrifice of praise to our Heavenly Father? He loves to hear his children bringing a song of praise, a sacrifice of praise to him. That is what brings joy to his heart. Are we willing to do that for him? Let's pray. Father, I thank you so much for this story, such a beautiful story that we find in your word. You meant for us to read this here in Northern Virginia in 2021. Even though it happened many years ago, it still shows us a picture of you. It shows us your character and how much you care about your children. And God, we're so grateful that we are your children. And so, Lord, whatever reality we find ourselves in today, we bring it to you. We trust you with that reality. We want to lean in. We want to draw closer to you. No matter if we're on a mountaintop or in a valley, God, we give it to you. We want to bring that to you, Lord. Thank you for each one here this morning. In Jesus' name, amen.